I can scoot over.
Yeah, you maybe that'd
That's
be
fine.
great, thank you. Yeah, it's on.
So moving on to the next recommendation, which is clearly define the public and private sphere. In the existing design plan, it talks about these interaction zones between the fully private, like within a building, and the fully public, which is the street. Oftentimes in downtowns, particularly like the historic downtowns, you get kind of this mixture of those where there might be benches or sidewalk cafe type seating. Sometimes there are sandwich boards for advertisements or things like that, and kind of that pseudo public-private sphere. So one of the things the town could do is look at more clearly defining that. And we gave an example in there. The third figure in your plan is exactly that, where essentially if you dedicated 5 feet to fully private, 5 feet to public sidewalk, and then 5 feet to more general public amenities like benches or wayfinding signs or other things that are already identified in the town plan. That's what the streetscape could look like in that road cross section. So you have an example there, but it might be something that the town would want to consider as more clearly defining where those areas are meant to go and the relationship between the buildings. Moving on, in terms of zoning, we discuss height limits. One of the things that we like to do is talk about contextual height limits. Instead of setting arbitrary 30 feet or 35 feet or 40 feet, depending on it, oftentimes height is something that people talk about as more of an experience. And there's a lot of different opinions on it, right? Some people think a 2-story building is too tall, where other people are fine with a 5-story building. And so it becomes this kind of subjective argument depending on what you think. Well, the town can adopt some standards relating to the adjacent public right-of-way that set more objective height standards. So the clearest example would be if you just have a normal right-of-way, 66 feet wide. If you set a 1-to-1 foot ratio, that means you could have a 66-foot tall building on that property. And that ratio doesn't have to be 1-to-1. It could be 1-to-3. So you could only allow a 22-foot building, or a third the width of the right-of-way. That ratio differs per community. Our recommendation would be to not go below a 1-to-3 ratio, because that is generally accepted as where you're gonna get kind of that tighter knit community. Anything below that tends to be a little bit too short. But a 22-foot tall building is not difficult to achieve for most of the buildings that you're looking at in this town center area. Then it also allows you the opportunity to have increasing height as setback goes back. So, for example, for every height, or for every foot you're more into the property, you would be allowed another height. That creates this kind of terracing, pyramid type effect to buildings. But in terms of residential properties, can be nice opportunities, particularly in apartments, for things like balconies that are set back from the street. In mixed-use buildings, you can have commercial above and retail below, and kind of show a delineation between those two. And again, looking at the town of Rome, obviously you're trying to encourage some, more walkable activity here, but you're not trying to go full downtown Chicago. So having those ratios set back as you move away from the public street sometimes can help moderate the visual impact of the height of buildings. We actually can have taller buildings and people get less upset about them because they don't experience the height in like the center of a 350-foot deep property. But ultimately that gives some clarity in terms of the heights that are allowed on there, and it removes that subjective argument from Plan Commission discussions. Moving on, we make some recommendations in terms of site design. So the first thing being sidewalks and bicycle parking. There's kind of a mixture of existing sidewalks and a lack of sidewalks in the Rome Town Center. Generally in these areas we try to encourage sidewalks, and I think the ones that are really, the existing ones in Rome Town Center are really good. You have the curb bump outs, which narrow the width that pedestrians have to cross a street. So generally it's safer. particularly for people with, you know, in a wheelchair or someone like a little kid who might be on a bike or something like that, who's not going to pay as close of attention. So I think there's a good foundation there in the Rome Town Center. There's also an existing raised mid-block crossing, which I think functions pretty well to slow traffic in those areas as well, which can be effective. So we talk about as the town looks to build out more of the roads, or as in the long run, as it repaves some of the roads or works with existing businesses, we would encourage you to continue adding those facilities to sites in the long run. In the meantime, realizing that the town's not going to put a sidewalk on every street next year, you can do things like encourage pedestrian connections through zoning and require them from the front entrance of a private building to the street. So regardless of how far it's set back, someone should be able to directly connect to the public street via a separated pedestrian path. That means, you know, a private sidewalk, you're not having to walk through a parking lot or something else to get to the public street. You can kind of have a safe route that's not mixed in with vehicle traffic or truck traffic to get to the street. So those things can kind of help mitigate and make a little bit more of a pedestrian-friendly environment without having to go full urban road cross-section from day one. I've seen those really successful in a lot of communities, and people, particularly developers, will always complain about them and those requirements. They always forget about them and think, you know, people just walk through the parking lot to get to the road, but they're often very frequently used once they go in. So it's kind of one of those things where, like sidewalks, people complain about them, but then are often the first people to use them once they're in. So, the town center plan, in terms of pedestrian infrastructure, also identifies things like other opportunities for ATVs, UTVs, golf carts, snowmobiles, mobility scooters, and relating your parking ratios to those. Sometimes communities will give credit to those parking spaces and not require, you know, X number of vehicle parking spaces and then a full separate set of bike, ATV, et cetera, parking spaces. You know, I'm pretty agnostic on whether the town would, you know, now or in the future allow those types of vehicles on public streets. But I do think if you do, it is a good idea to give parking credits for those things on sites, particularly in this area specifically where you're trying to encourage a little bit more of a pedestrian-friendly or slower streets, things like that. Moving on, for vehicle parking requirements, there's essentially two levels of action that the town could consider. The first would be reducing its vehicle parking requirements. Because you have a separated Rome Town Center guidelines, that would not affect the development outside. I understand, you know, at Sand Valley or some of the resorts, golf course areas, you might care more about parking because there might not be on-street parking in those areas where off-street parking regulations do make sense. But when you are trying to encourage a more walkable area where people would park and then kind of walk between businesses, we typically try to reduce the parking requirements in those areas where the town wouldn't be over mandating how much parking it requires for a specific business. So the first step in that tier would be reducing your parking requirements, you know, cutting them by half. Looking at some other historic downtowns and what they require, and you know, trying to right-size the number of parking spaces that you require. There are some national guidelines that you can look at for those businesses as well, to kind of give reference to how much parking that you actually need, so you're not just like throwing a dart on the wall. Some of those are also really hard to administer in the long run, which I think a lot of legislative bodies don't think about, but you know, if you're going to adopt a parking standard for X number of employees, well, our question is always, who's monitoring the number of employees in your clinic, for instance? If you need X number of parking spaces per doctor, I don't think that clinic is notifying the town when they hire or fire a doctor, so how are you going to administer your parking space requirements in response to that? So moving away from those types of things and moving more towards a set square footage requirement or things, if you are going to keep parking requirements, is something that we'd recommend. The step beyond that and one that many cities, towns, and villages throughout both Wisconsin and the country are starting to consider, particularly in walkable areas like Rome Town Center, is removing parking requirements entirely from your code and just saying that's not something that we administer when we review site plans. The idea from that is oftentimes parking is very expensive to install, so you're adding costs to developers that they could spend on landscaping or building materials or other things. You're also acknowledging that oftentimes the market is the best knowledge in how many parking spaces they should require. So, when Quick Trip's coming in, they already know how many parking spaces they need for their site. So the town having a set of standards on top of that is almost meaningless, because they're gonna build, unless you're setting, amount that's so crazy that you'd be forcing them to build a ton, they already know it. Same for an apartment, a senior living facility, a brewery, any other type of retail business. Generally, they're gonna know about how many customers they can handle at a time, how much parking they need. And thankfully, there's a lot of street parking in the Rome Town Center, so you can do things like people can park on the street and walk over, which is something that the design plan is trying to encourage anyways. So a lot of communities think that's a big step, and I understand politically sometimes that's not easy to take in one big step, but ultimately that is the way a lot of communities are going, is deciding that to get out of the parking game entirely and let businesses decide how much they need. That doesn't mean you can't have standards regarding parking, by the way. So you could still have landscaping standards, screening standards. If people are gonna put in a parking lot, it has to look like however you prescribe, but that's just removing the set number of vehicle space requirements from your code. I'm gonna stop there and ask if anyone has any questions, because we're about a half hour into it. So does anyone have any questions about anything so far? All right, we'll forge ahead. Next up would be architectural standards. Again, in the Rome Town Center design plan, there are a lot of aspirational standards in there. My understanding is that the town, while it likes natural materials and kind of some more classic styles of architecture, the town doesn't want to go like full new Glarus and require a single type of architecture for the entire area. So one of the things that we recommend in here is to perhaps remove some of those aspirational notes from your design plan, or if you do update the zoning code, because it doesn't seem like the town really cares about them too much. But acknowledging that you still do care about some of the architecture, adopting things like more strict and clear materials requirements, or roof pitch designs, or things like that, to kind of decide the things that the town does care about in terms of architectural standards, and adopt those again as an objective standard, and let the rest kind of go away. So materials, roof pitches, symmetry, those tend to be the most popular across communities, because those kind of put you towards a more classic building shape. The materials, obviously depend per community and per architectural style, but generally looking around here, if you wanted to allow things like standing seam metal or architectural metal panels, or large timber buildings versus kind of standing timber, a more like Scandinavian style. None of that. I don't have an opinion on any of that. That is each town's and community's place, but I would think long and hard about adopting those as more objective standards, and then kind of letting the rest of the subjective aspirational things go away. Next, we'll get into landscaping and signage standards. So for landscaping, I think there are some good basic things in the Rome Town Center zoning district, but it probably needs a little bit more clarity. One of the options that we highlighted in here, and you see it in figure 5, is a set of objective landscaping standards. So when a parking lot is adjacent to a public right-of-way, this comes from the Village of Mount Pleasant in Racine County, who I do some work for, says it gives a developer options. So you're not being so prescriptive that they only have one way to go when they're designing a site. You just say, if you have 10 feet between your parking lot and the street right of way, you can go with option A. If you have 5 feet you can go with option B. And oftentimes, as it gets narrower, you're becoming more strict as you get closer to the street. So, and then option C is if the parking lot is right on the right-of-way line. Those options go from only landscaping if you have more street to a landscaping and a decorative fence if you have kind of a middle option to a full masonry wall blocking and screening the parking if that parking lot is right against the street line. So, you know, those distances might not be the same for the town of Rome, but I think the underlying concept is one that you should consider. It's nice to give developers options, but a few options, not a ton of options, and say, here's how you can design your parking lots. This is in relation to screening, but there are other areas you could do that as well. So thinking about that for landscaping standards. Also, in the design plan, it identifies natural landscaping as something that's important to the area. I know there's a lot of discussion up here about natural landscaping. So we did include some basic knowledge, just if anyone's reading through this. You know, you're in the glacial Lake Wisconsin sandplain ecoregion, and if you go to the DNR, the Surface Water Data Viewer, which is an online map from the DNR, will actually give you the original vegetation cover of the area. Someone in the 90s took some maps from the 1840s when they originally surveyed Wisconsin and took that and turned that into a digital map so you can see what was here before people were here. And so the DNR says jack pine, jack oak, eastern white pine, red pine, tamarack, black spruce, blue joint, and prairie cordgrass are kind of the general larger groups of vegetation that were in the area. So how you boil that down to a zoning code is oftentimes, you know, if there's going to be trees on your site, you give a limited option of trees to consider instead of just saying, you know, oftentimes when you identify natural landscaping, you know, particular if someone's from out of the area, they might pull from landscaping that is more in line with Dane County or Iowa and say it's a Midwest natural landscaping instead of something that's a little bit more specific to the area. So you can adopt some more clear standards. A landscape architect can help you dial down on, you know, individual varietals of those trees, and you know, there's so many cross hybrids now and things that survive better in temperature fluctuations, salt fluctuations, which ones work as street trees, which ones work as rain gardens, all those types of things. So, but in general, we wanted to identify kind of the base layer for you and give you some of the tools to have that conversation, really dial in on what you mean by natural landscaping for the community. Next up, you know, we think it would be worthwhile to take a second look at an updated town center roadway cross-section. It relates to some of that public-private conversation I was talking about a little bit earlier. But in here, you're really trying to, per the design plan, encourage a very pedestrian-forward area. Something that probably doesn't look very similar to the rest of the town or similar to some of the you know, resort areas in the town. So taking a second look and perhaps having a separate set of road standards and roadway cross-sections for the town center might make some sense. The National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO, has an urban street design guide that, while you're not going to adopt all of those standards, because some of them talk about bus rapid transit or other things that you'll never find in the town of Rome, there are some good bits and pieces in there, and that's all available online. So what you see in the figure is a really nice figure showing curb extensions, some of which already exist in the town center. But it's a nice. Sometimes you get people who don't see the vision, and NACTO has a really good set of clear design guides and recommendations for a more pedestrian-focused street environment. So we recommend using them as a base, but having that conversation again and really perhaps adopting a separate set of standards than your normal town road standards. Then at the same time, you're not ad hoc designing it as the town decides to put in streets or repave streets over time. Next up, we have a little discussion in here on the existing trails. We realize that there are some trails that run through the existing Rome Town Center area, some of which are in locations that are good and some of which might hinder future locations. So essentially what we say in here is, encourage those trail connections. We think they're, on the whole, trail connections are good and help kind of interconnect a larger town center, but we'd caution against being too protective of the exact location of those trail connections as development goes through. Oftentimes, they could be reconfigured in ways that might better connect existing businesses with future businesses, or provide nice back of house services or other things for it where the trails could do kind of double duty in those. An example of that might be if you have private on-site septic. A trail is a nice area for someone to come in and perhaps provide maintenance to that in the back, without having to pull all the way through the site and pave like a rear entrance to something that might be in a rear field. So as you're looking at site plans, think about those things where the trails can be nice pedestrian amenities 99% of the time and provide nice back of house services the rest of the time. So those are the majority of the design-focused things we have in here. What we also provided next are some of the other things that we'll get into. So the first up being a fiscal analysis worksheet. This is a fillable worksheet that you all have in front of you, and it is essentially created using some of the town's existing budgetary documents and costs of construction, as well as year-over-year budget, to make sure that when someone's proposing a new development, particularly in the Rome Town Center, that it's more or less paying for the services that you all have to provide it, particularly being a rural community, and one with things like Sand Valley and resorts that don't completely take care of themselves, but oftentimes have internal support services for a lot of their own functions, their own security teams, things like that. The town center is something different for the town, and so I think it's important that when you're getting developments in here, if someone comes in and says, no, we don't like that, it's too dense, there are other things to consider when reviewing developments other than someone's thoughts on density. For example, a denser development here would pay for more services that you're going to have to provide a business one way or another. So your urban, it's more trying to closely link your urban form with the services that you have to provide it. And just, it's not the be-all end-all. If something doesn't shake out in the fiscal analysis worksheet, it doesn't mean you immediately have to deny it. Obviously, there are things like nonprofits or parks that you have to provide services to that are amenities in other ways. But for private businesses, multifamily developments, senior living developments that oftentimes require a little bit more services, this is a nice double check for you all to kind of run the numbers and be like, we're providing this water service, we're providing police, fire on a per acre basis. This more or less will pay for itself, or it won't, and we know by how much, and we can consider that in the town budget process. So if you look at the fiscal analysis worksheet, it's just an Excel sheet with some linked values in the back that you all have now. So on each individual development, you'll be able to fill in these green boxes here, how many acres the development is, the estimated value from the assessor, the total taxable value, the adjacent roadway infrastructure that you're liable to consider. And then on the back end, there are some service costs taken from your budget. So you can see on a residential per unit basis for 2022, the town should be getting per unit about 345 essentially dollars per unit, and that's the cost of service that you're providing it. So you can do, as the number of units escalates, you can run that over time. There's also a commercial industrial average there as well. And that's assuming your current level of services. That's not assuming a change in that. All those numbers are fillable over time, so as your budgets change year over year, you can continue to update those numbers and make sure they're up to date. And then the last thing it does is it extrapolates those out over 40 years. So not only in year one would a development pay for itself when it's fully assessed, down the road when you have to repave the adjacent street or completely rebuild the adjacent street, will the development have paid as many taxes as it should over the long run that it's paying for itself in the long run? So that is 40 years is chosen because generally you probably repave a road about every 20 years and you probably reconstruct it about every 40. So it's the average we use in here. to base those things off of. All of those numbers are changeable over time too, so if the town has any questions or needs to modify that in any way, we can certainly advise you on how to do it, or someone in your finance department can dive in the deep end and try to figure out the Excel worksheet, and we're happy to tell them how it works and walk them through it as well. So.
Okay.
The next thing we did, there's not a printout, but it's on the flash drive, so you should have it. It's a set RFP document. If you go to the town website, you'll see that people can reach out to the town to purchase property within Rome Town Center. So we just created kind of a property sheet that the town might consider if it wants to, particularly if it's going to subdivide some of those areas and sell off smaller parcels. They should be able to take those in and put it into a property worksheet and perhaps have dedicated, RFP sales documents for each individual parcel it wants to sell, as opposed to just kind of generally contact us about the Rome Town Center if you want to buy land. So we thought that would just be a nice add-on. It's pretty simple and should be able to be changed on the fly as you get things like environmental information or, ALTA surveys or other types of legal documents for land sale purposes. And then the last document we provided is the map in front of you. Like I said, that's fully editable. You'll have the documents on there. So you have it on the sheet that I brought with me or the flash drive for the town today. So this is based off the 2022 map that you have, and you can update it as you see fit, or you can ask us to make updates as you would like as well. The last thing we included in here is a brief discussion about tax incremental financing and municipal assistance, which I know is something dear to the heart of many CDAs across. It is rare that developers do not come in with an ask in many communities. And due to increasing costs of construction and those types of things, we're seeing it more and more, in particular in communities that don't regularly see municipal assistance requests. So you don't see a lot now. I know you have one active TID. You'll probably see them in the future. So what we typically recommend in that scenario is to be a little bit proactive about it and have those discussions now. We don't want to say, without knowing an exact development or detail, we didn't give you a lot of specific recommendations in here of you should definitely adopt a new TIF district over the Rome Town Center. We didn't go down that path, but I think it's probably a conversation worth having over time, whether it's, if you do take that subdivided area and say that's going to be the next priority, it might be worth considering proactively creating a TID over it to allow for the recapture of some of the public infrastructure that you're going to have to put in on the front end. Obviously, tax incremental financing can be a tough topic in a lot of communities, so we don't recommend that lightly, but it's a really powerful tool, and it's basically the only tool that municipalities have in terms of economic development. So you really have to wade into it one way or another. We think being proactive about it and identifying those public goods that you want to see in a project plan when you're creating a TID on the front end is a conversation worth having. So when you do get those requests in, you have already had that conversation and you can direct the developers to the resources that you have or are not willing to offer them, as opposed to having to bring everything up ad hoc, and then it becomes this individual negotiation scenario that can be tough on the developer, but really tough on you all. So that is the long and short of my 15 recommendations. I'm happy to talk about any of the rest of them in detail.
Since we only have like 10 minutes before our plan commission, I'd like to have the CDA ask their questions first. So if we're going to start, if anybody wants to go first, or I know I have quite a few, but anybody ready to go? Or I did want to ask about the land in the back there where you have it divided. If we were to put out an RFP, we've talked about it for housing, and we've had a number of developers already express interest, and we have one that's looking at purchasing land right now. We're in the process. But if we were looking at putting something out for multifamily, is a TIF usually part of that conversation? Is that something you wait for them to maybe approach you on, or if? And then also the way that you have that land divided, that right now is multifamily, or senior housing, what we would put it out, for mixed family? Do we go after one? Do we let the developer come to us and suggest that? How do you approach that subject? I mean, as a CDA, we've done so many different housing studies. Now the county is doing another one. We've done 2 ourselves. They've also had one that the university did a couple of years ago that we went through. Each one of us took a portion of that, and now rural USDA is having them do another, I didn't do that on purpose, having the county do another one.
Yep.
So I mean, you can keep spending money and having data, but we know we need some sort of housing.
Yeah.
So now I showed you where that road, we did a water main go through there, but now we don't have money for the main road. So how would you approach that? What would be a suggestion? Where do we begin with that RFP?
You know, if it's always best if you don't have to do a TID and the developer will just put it in, great. You know, take the money and run. That's kind of, you know, the basics of how development should work. But in today's environment, that's oftentimes, it's not that simple of a conversation. So I think being prepared to go through a request for assistance on a residential product should be something that the town wants, should be something that is value dense enough where it is going to pay for itself. So sometimes that's having a tough conversation about density, particularly for many towns. This is where they struggle. But I think Rome Town Center is a proactive approach to saying, this is where we're going to put our density, and other areas it's not where it's going to be, instead of having a very ad hoc approach throughout the town where you see it appearing on the corners of county highways or other types of things like that. So I think this is a good first step that you've already taken. But yeah, I would be prepared to have conversations about pushing density and making sure that whatever investment you put in, that you're getting out on the back end, both political investment and financial investment in those developments. And then I recommend having a process set up in which to evaluate those. So if they are going to request assistance, what we see a lot of communities doing is going with a third-party financial advisor. Ehlers does, you know, 3/4 of the communities throughout the state. They'll take a look at someone's pro forma and validate that they do indeed need assistance for their project. And you can also right size and make sure that they're not being over-incented. So for this market, are their rates of return, you know, based on their project costs, average for the market? Or are they really blowing it out of the water? Or are they really not going to be able to make this work? So, you know, taking a look at how much equity someone's putting in a project, what type of investors they're putting in, you know, all that type of stuff. Have those processes set up. I think on the front end, if you're expecting some requests on the multifamily side, can really save a lot of heartache. And that way you're not negotiating individual amounts with developers. That becomes like a horse trading scenario really quickly. And I think the waters can get muddled. So particularly for smaller towns, I would say have a strict process set up, direct developers to the process, have them go through it, and then, you know, evaluate it on the back end.
Okay. Anyone else?
I just have a quick question. What are your thoughts on, we've got the zoning or the divisions of how the land is used set up. When someone comes to us with wants to do something on a piece of property that is not zoned for what they want to do, and just says, well, we can just change that. We can just adjust the zoning because we really would like your business. Should we be doing that or stick with how it's set up so we don't end up with this hodgepodge?
I think a little bit of both. So, you know, the first recommendations we talked through is being a little bit less use specific. So I think development is always a two-way street. If the town becomes less use specific and allows a broader variety of uses throughout the town center without having such strict delineations between the different sub-districts, that is the town recognizing that developers are going to ask for more flexibility. So we're going to be a little bit more proactive about it. But say the town really doesn't want self-storage, for example, or something like that. That is where I draw the line. So, you know, I always like to remind boards and commissions that zoning is a police power. The same constitutional powers that grant your police the ability to write someone a speeding ticket are the same constitutional powers that grant the town to administer zoning. That's through, you know, the Constitution to the state of Wisconsin, and they delegate that power to you. That is a legislative power, and you should have legislative conversations about your zoning district. So I like to be proactive about writing laws, and then I like to stick to those laws. That's not to say you can never bend, but if it's a development you love, but you know, you're writing laws for a reason. We allow people who get a speeding ticket to have some flexibility in how they pay, but we don't allow them to get off scot-free. So similar flexibility is what I like to recommend for zoning.
The only other question I had is there's not much green space in here except for the one little part where the park
The
is.
existing park is.
Was that something you considered when you looked at it? You think that's enough green space, or a developer with that multi-use facility should be required to have green space?
I typically don't recommend prescriptive green space ratios per individual development, but I do like to have developers, like some of the screening standards we highlight, there are consequences to their actions. So essentially, if you're gonna put in a ton of parking, you're also gonna have to put in a ton of landscaping to mitigate those parking standards. So that's how I like to approach green space. For private development, it's essentially, you know, whatever path you choose, there are pros and cons. If you're gonna put in a lot of hard space, you're gonna put in a lot of green space at the same time. In terms of public green space, I think that's a conversation the town probably needs to have and is outside the scope of this one, because you're talking about taking taxable land in an area that's already served by a park and setting that aside for more non-taxable area. My understanding is there's, you know, looking at pickleball courts and other public facilities in the area as well. So I think green space is great, but you know, I think the town should also acknowledge that in a town center, there's gonna be less green space in general. So you're just gonna have to be a little bit more comfortable with that. It's a big town, you have a lot of green space. So I would not be overly protective of it in a town center where you're trying to encourage a little bit of density and walkability.
Okay.
So you're saying like if we would have if we would put out an RFP for housing and we sell a number of those lots in the back, we could, as part of that development, we could say so much of that has to be within your development, or they would come back and say so much of that would be their own green space as part of their development.
It's one of the ways that you could do it.
Right. So, but I mean.
And you know, I think people like to look at parks as public green space and then ignore the rest. There are a lot of other public green spaces they can include. Everything from stormwater swales to street trees. Those provide greenery in areas. You know, landscaping beds at intersections. Those provide little pockets of green space to help green up an area without, you know, it being fully natural, but still are meaningful to people and add property value.
Anybody else have questions? Did anybody in the audience have questions? Nick?
I do. So the zoning district recommendation you have makes sense, because it certainly provides for some flexibility. Can you kind of talk through how to reconcile that with the design plan that we have that certainly recognizes there's certain sub-districts that could concentrate certain types of development versus just having a unified, you know, zoning district that doesn't necessarily have the sub-districts, and how do you then reconcile that with, you know, uses that we have? Do we keep that large number of uses like we have in our sub-districts, or do we cut that way down and basically broaden the flexibility?
I like to reduce specificity in use definitions, so instead of defining every type of retail business, just say retail, and really consolidate those together, but then have a really thorough conversation about the uses that the town doesn't want to see. So it's almost a subtractive process about here are the 10 uses that are not going to be in the district, and then we allow everything else. So that's how I like to go through the use conversation. Ultimately, I think a lot of people care more about a building's form than they do its like its underlying use, except in a few cases. You know, self-storage, adult businesses, you know, those types of things that get very controversial. But other than that, you know, zoning was originally created to separate like hard industry like slaughterhouses from residential. And we've gotten so specific in some areas, we like to bring it a little bit back to basics and say a lot of these things, particularly in the town center, can live next to each other. Your industrial is not gonna be super difficult to be next to a residence 9 times out of 10. So let's acknowledge that, but still identify a few of those uses that aren't gonna fit in there.
And I think I asked the question because when we went through the process of updating our zoning code to build in those sub-districts, we were largely guided by the design plan.
Mhm.
In other words, the design plan was created and then we used that with the sub-district to put together what, we have in our ordinance. What I'm hearing is maybe working in concert to an extent with the design plan, but kind of taking a step back and having conversations about what we want, not necessarily totally guided by the design plan or mandated by the design plan. We were very much trying to stick to the design plan when we were going through those sub-districts.
And I honestly think that, like I said from the start, the design plan, 95% of it is great. But I think that is somewhere on the planning and zoning side where the practice has changed really quickly. Even in the last 5 years, you see a lot of communities getting away from that type of overly specific use category. So I don't think that's a fault of the design plan. Honestly, I just think practice is changing quickly enough where you see a lot of communities realizing as the market's gotten tough and as we're in this weird post-COVID world where things on the retail side got even more messed up, that they're having to be a lot more flexible to get the kind of downtown retail uses that they want to see.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering how the proposed changes, or whatever might be changing, would affect our gateway district and zoning in there.
Well, Gateway is not in the town center. Gateway, though,
But,
references town center standards.
Right.
So it may take some more drafting in the Gateway. In other,
I'm thinking like setbacks and what he was talking about with regard to the setbacks and things of that sort.
So
In
I-
gateway, I just don't know if I might have to rethink that if we're gonna go in that direction.
well, it may not be as easy as just cross-referencing commercial is what I'm saying.
Right.
It may take the same kind of conversation for Gateway, figure out what your standards really are. And if those standards are commercial as they exist today, you're gonna have to flesh them out because you won't just be simply able to reference that if we're
Yeah.
putting in a more broad district like that.
Okay.
There was one point, we are running just a little bit over, but we did get a late start because of some technology issues here. But just one question, we did talk earlier about when you were talking about uses and about conditional uses and that sort of thing without getting too deep into it. If maybe you just Nick touched on it too a little bit. If maybe you can say how some of those things, if you can ease them up and with them being in ordinances, maybe you can just touch on that really quickly, like maybe how that could help us too in the Rome Town Center as we look at changing some of this up, that might make it easier for us as well.
Yeah, in general,
Act 67, how some of that brought this to light as well.
yeah, so for those who are not familiar, in 2017, the Wisconsin legislature
Oh, familiar.
adopted Act 67, which really reduced communities' ability to regulate things via conditional uses to a large part. Yeah, it's a lot harder to deny them without substantial evidence. And so in a lot of communities, we're recommending going away from conditional uses almost entirely. And that is because when you boil down to it, you're requiring an applicant to go through a public hearing. So you're by default letting the public come in and discuss a use. But if the town board or the planning commission doesn't have the ability to deny that underlying use, and you have a bunch of angry residents in it, it places those appointed and elected officials in a really sticky situation where it makes it look like you're not being responsive to their demands, but you have an attorney there who's saying, you gotta approve that or you're gonna get sued. So we're just trying to sidestep that conversation entirely. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of work to get rid of your conditional uses because it requires a lot of proactive conversations about the standards that we do want to apply to different uses that we typically do through a conditional use process now. So, we typically recommend kind of go through your conditional uses one by one, but you know, if there are conditional uses that come up in front of the town board now, where you typically apply the same standards and you almost never deny them, that's a really good two-step way to say that probably doesn't need to be a conditional use anymore, and start to use those things. Similarly, things that you receive a lot of variances for, that might go to your Board of Appeals, would be in the same boat, where it's, you know, this isn't working in some way, so it's a good note of this is something that we should fine tune. But yeah, you know, it's really, it's trying to say, it's hard enough to be an appointed or elected official these days to find people who want to do that stuff. So setting yourself up to get yelled at for something you have no option but to approve is, it's just brutal. So try to recommend going away from that.
All right then. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate everybody coming to the special meeting. Thank you, Sam, very much, and we look forward to working on this in the future. If we have any questions, we can have them come back, or we'll send them down to them, and appreciate working with you again in the future.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Yes, thank you very much. So dates and items for future agenda meetings, next agenda items, we'll build this out, and our next meeting date and time will be June 5th, I believe, at 3 p.m. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.